Supporters of Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro have blocked roads across the country after he lost Sunday's runoff vote to Lula da Silva. Truck drivers in the nation's largest city, Sao Paulo, are protesting on the road leading to its international airport. Flights have been delayed, with protesters threatening to block access completely. Mr. Bolsonaro has yet to concede defeat following Sunday's presidential election. He is due to address the nation in the coming hours. It's not yet clear whether that means an acceptance of the result or a challenge to them.
We don't agree with this electoral result, so we are doing this peaceful protest to see if we can change it. We don't agree with it. We think it can't work. A man who has left jail to govern our country. I can't agree with it.
Well, congratulations for Lula have poured in from across the world, including from the leaders of the UK, China, France, India and Russia. US President Biden said the win came following free, fair and credible elections.
And the strength of Brazil's democratic institutions, which perform their constitutional roles in a free and fair election, conducted with transparency. A hallmark of every democracy is acceptance of the will of the people as expressed through elections, followed by a peaceful transfer of power. That's what the world will expect and what we anticipate they will see.
With more on this story, let's bring in our ICE correspondent Laurie Laird, who's monitoring events from London. Laurie, so Jair Bolsonaro's silence over his electoral defeat creating tensions across Brazil, with lorry drivers who support him blocking roads. What's the latest?
That's right. And some of those driver protests have been dispersed over the past couple of hours. And that's only after a Supreme Court ruling this morning that said that these drivers were protesting illegally. They were subject to fines if they continued to block roads. That said, while some of these protests have been dispersed, roads in 21 Brazilian states are still pretty clogged up. And that's starting to have some implications for food distribution. But as you say, radio science from Jair Bolsonaro, also oddly from Lula, the presumptive winner of the election. So there very much is a bit of an information vacuum coming out of the capital, Brasilia, this evening. Now, we have heard from allies of Jair Bolsonaro that he is intending to speak. His communications minister alerted reporters to say that something was coming. And in fact, his son, who's a senator, Flavio Bolsonaro, has seemed to have conceded defeat. He thanked supporters in the election, seemed to suggest that he was happy to sit in opposition to the president, although he'll form one of the dominant party in the Senate. Here we're looking at the presidential palace right now, Charles, but we're getting absolutely no word from the presidential palace. We're now at 2:00 in the afternoon in Brasilia, still hoping that something may come. But as you started by saying, tension is certainly rising with every hour that passes, and we hear nothing from who we assume is the defeated presidential candidate.
Well, I mean, we're just getting information that he may well be speaking by 6 p.m. GMT tonight, which is 7 p.m. Nigerian local time. But as you said, Laurie, lorry drivers already staging protests. I mean, I wonder how extraordinary it is how quickly that developed. Because, I mean, overnight, the number of protests are reported to have gone through the roof across Brazil, with more than 300 major roads shut. I mean, you said many of them have been opened now.
Well, some of them have been open, but here is the tension, Charles, because it is not only these lorry drivers who are supported of Bolsonaro, who remains the president until the 1st of January in any case, but it's the federal highway police who have been tasked with breaking up these protests, who are also great supporters of Bolsonaro. And in fact, the head of that federal highway police organization tweeted his support for Bolsonaro in the days ahead of the election. So in the absence of any word from Bolsonaro, I think one way to try and assess how how forceful is the support for Bolsonaro is to see whether these protests are broken up across the nation. How hard will the federal highway police try to break up these protests, because they are typically this police force typically supporters of Bolsonaro. And in fact, there was video that emerged yesterday of some of these highway police actually cheering the protesters on. Different sets of video today. We did see some of them using tear gas to disperse protesters, some using a more softly approach, trying to talk them down. But as I say, not all of these protests have been cleared, and the force tasked with clearing these protesters is very, very loyal to the sitting president.
Well, that's a very interesting angle to this story. It has to be said, though, that although there have been protests and some confrontations, there's been no violence reported so far. So could these protests dissipate just as quickly as they came about, especially if there is a placatory statement from Mr. Bolsonaro?
Absolutely. But I think it will take that kind of a statement, a clear concession from Mr. Bolsonaro, to get these protests to die down. And you make a very good point, Charles, that these protests have been peaceful, and that has been one of the main concerns of this election. Remember, ahead of the election, Mr. Bolsonaro said that it was only God that could remove him from office, and he has always been a stalwart supporter of gun rights. So there was always a fear that these protests could turn violence. But in the absence of some sort of statement from him, that risk will continue to exist. I think for the sake of Brazil, let's hope he has something to say in the coming hours, and it's something to say that is, as you said, placatory, something that keeps Brazilians away from wanting to incite any kind of violence. But given his rhetoric in the past, he really is going to have to come out with quite a concessionary statement.
Okay, we're going to be watching that very closely. Thank you for that analysis, Laurie. And as I said, he's expected, Jair Bolsonaro, to speak at about 6 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which is 7 p.m. Nigerian time. No guarantees, of course. Laurie Laird with her assessment of the latest developments in Brazil.